Good evening, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Norbert de Costa, President of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. I speak to you from Brampton, Ontario, a part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Brampton is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The dish represents the land, and the spoon represents the peoples of the treaty. The treaty is to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures humans share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that the peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. World Federalists view the world as one society, embracing all of humanity in all its diversity. We call for urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions, which are essential to assure a peaceful, just, and ecologically sustainable world community. Immediately following this featured event, approximately an hour from now, or maybe an hour and a half, um, the World Federalists will remain on the Zoom meeting to answer any questions the audience may have regarding World Federalism, the World Federalist Movement, and to announce some of the Toronto branch's upcoming events you may be interested in. Today, it is my pleasure to announce the second lecture in our series on issues that can only be fully and effectively addressed by good global governance, issues such as climate change, war and peace, international economics, migration, and equity and social justice for all of the human race. Today's speaker is Guy Dauncey, and the topic is the economics of kindness, a 10-year transition to a green cooperative economy. Moderating the Q&A session following this lecture is our Director of Communications, Erica Wilson. First, a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a chat button, which you can use to chat with everyone on the meeting or with facilitators. You will also use the chat feature to submit your questions. Here to introduce and welcome Guy Dauncey is our own Peter Benton. Peter?
Oh, so thank you, Norbert. So Guy Dauncey is an anthropological economist, a futurist, and author who wants to develop a positive vision of a sustainable future for the world. He's the founder of the British Columbia Sustainable Energy Association and a fellow of the London-based Royal Society for the Arts that is committed to funding or finding practical solutions to social changes. Guy is also a host of a TV show called Change the World, a motivational speaker and author or co-author of 10 books, including the following 3: Cancer 101, Solutions to a Preventable Epidemic. Number 2, The Climate Challenge, 100 Solutions to Global Warming. And 3, Journey to the Future, A Better World is Possible, set in 2032. Guy lives in Yellow Point, Ladysmith, British Columbia. And for more information, you can reach him at his website titled The Practical Utopian. It's www.thepracticalutopian.ca. Guy is currently Guy is currently 5 years into the writing of a major new book on the topic of his presentation this evening, The Economics of Kindness, a 10-year transition to a new ecological civilization. It's an amazingly comprehensive book as it joins to the narrow discipline of economics the following: anthropology, which is about understanding power relations, political science, philosophy, sociology, and ecological economics. The book will expose the false ideas in economic thinking over the last 300 years that began in the Age of Enlightenment. The book will develop the 12 foundations of a green cooperative economy. And a green cooperative economy is a cultural system based on the values of cooperation and kindness, with ecological wisdom expressed in the economy through the use of democracy. The book will conclude with some practical guidance for how we can use the green cooperative economics to first end our climate and biodiversity emergencies, two, to achieve a transformation of trade, global financial architecture, and the global economy, and three, build a new ecological civilization. So I expect that Guy's presentation this evening will give us a good preview of the book. So please welcome Guy Dauncey virtually.
Well, thanks, Peter, for that introduction. It makes me feel like, oh my goodness, we've got to squeeze all this into 45 minutes. How can that be
Amazing.
done? How can that be done? So let me just share the book I'm working on. I don't have a publisher yet, so I'm manifesting finding a publisher. So here in the Economics of Kindness, a 10-year transition to a new ecological civilization, we got 4 huge pieces to unpack. And I'll start with the new ecological civilization, because I believe with many other people, I think I share this insight that this is the most critical decade in the history of our civilization so far. The data that's coming in on the threat from global climate change, the global climate emergency, and the biodiversity emergency is stomach-churningly awful. I am a climate alarmist, but I'm not a climate doomer. We need to be alarmed. And simultaneously, we have, for people who are stuck in the housing crisis, a horrendous situation, whether in terms of buying or renting, with something seriously going wrong with our economy. Meanwhile, we have billionaires who can afford to splash their money going into space. We have abusive corporations that will use private finance to buy a corporation, strip its assets, take profits, and throw the workers onto unemployment. And so we're thinking, like, what is going on with all this? So the starting piece for me is like the widespread impulse to kindness among people. We experience kindness among humans as a warm outreaching of the heart, a generosity, a willingness to help each other, to chip in, to work together. It's a very widely shared human impulse. In addition, we need to extend it to kindness to nature. And that's a new concept for most of us. Just yesterday, we learned that in the Faroe Islands, they'd done their thing called annual grind, and they'd herded over 1,400 Atlantic white-sided dolphins into a bay where they struggled and died before being killed. And they were just, even the people in the Faroe Islands feel that's beyond the pale, it's brutal. But we have a brutal history of our relationship to nature. And one person who was commenting on that said, you know, we can't really be alarmed about that without being hypocritic, because every day we do the same to millions of farm animals in order to eat meat. So we need to extend kindness to nature as well as to humans. The need for a 10-year transition is because of the urgency of the decade. The encouraging thing is that the 1930s to 40s became, bizarrely, in spite of the buildup of Nazism and stuff, starting in America with the New Deal under Roosevelt, the impulse to cooperate managed to defeat the impulse to be greedy and selfish and to dominate. And that meant people were so distressed by a combination of the great crash of 1929, then the Great Depression, and they'd come out of World War I, they thought, we need to change the game here. And a whole whack of laws and regulations and things were put in place to allow trade unions to flourish, to suppress the power of banks. And it led to the whole period from 1945 to 1975, a very stable economic life, with almost no banking collapses, no crises. And it was only in the mid-70s that those people who had felt cut out of that, which is primarily people who thought with neoclassical economic ideas, we call them neoliberals, those who wanted government to get out of the way and there'd be freedom for corporations to do what they wanted, they managed to reclaim control over the economy under the philosophy of Milton Friedman, who said that a corporation has no duty apart from to its shareholders, that if a corporation spends time producing affordable housing for its workers, or donating to build a swimming pool in the town where it's based, or even helping its workers with shorter working hours and investing in research, the only duty they have is selfishly to maximize shareholder dividends in return. That has brought just outrageously awful outcomes for all of us. And that paradigm of economics, which I'll explain shortly, should have collapsed in 2008, when the core of the economy had a meltdown, and all of the big banks and that had gambled with money went into collapse and came rushing to the government saying, bail us out, give us a public bailout, which we did. And they used the bailout, some of them, to increase their own bonuses and to pay themselves yet more money. It should have collapsed then, but it didn't, because there was some of the time wasn't quite ready. But the combination of COVID and the increasing awareness of the climate and biodiversity emergencies, and increasing awareness of the housing crisis and the level of poverty in societies, I believe has created that very, very timely moment now for this decade, when this can be a decade of transformational change, when more ambitious projects than we ever dreamed of can be achieved. So if we're going to critique economics and critique what's happening, we need to have a sound diagnosis, and which should, if it's the right paradigm, lead to a sound set of solutions. One of the troubles with trying to analyze stuff in the economy up to now has been our diagnosis has struggled. So people have found different ways to try and reform capitalism or make us, socially responsible capitalism, or they flip to the other side and they want to have, much more socialism and sort of more state control. But in my reading of history and anthropology, I came to I've twisted around all those books behind me there. I've read 350 books on economics and economic history and anthropology over the last 6 years while trying to understand this thing. And I'm astonished at what I understand now that I took for granted that I didn't understand 6 years ago. I'd lived all my life without understanding this core stuff. And it's liberating. I found it personally very liberating. The modern paradigm of economics that emerged with Adam Smith started off by basically saying mercantilism, which is nationalism applied to trade, and use piracy, grab what you can for the country, do what you can to stop other people trading, didn't work anymore because it stopped innovation and it stopped things happening. And you needed to, and Adam Smith invented this term of the invisible hand that says that if only businesses will act selfishly, everyone will benefit. And the businesses love that. They took that to the bank and they used it to say the market, this invisible thing called the market, must be allowed to dominate because there are laws of economics which operate in the market, because humans are inherently self-interested and rational. We'll always do what's best for everyone. And Adam Smith was fundamentally wrong, because what caused the breakthrough to modern economic development was not the market or free trade or anything like that. It was innovation. It was technical innovation, powered by fossil fuels. If you imagine a bunch of really free traders with nothing changing, no innovation, which was the situation in the Middle Ages, the only way to get ahead is by paying your workers less, cutting corners or stealing or doing the dirty on your fellow traders. And that's why the guilds were set up as cooperative entities to stop people doing that. Once you've got innovation, you need to let those things go free. So that paradigm led all the way through to thinking in the late 1890s, which became the neoclassical paradigm, which basically said that every human is inherently selfish and self-interested. Every human is totally rational. And when we behave like that, the laws of the market will kick into play. And if we follow the laws of the market, everything will be best for everyone. So here's some description from other people who've called the neoclassical paradigm, I'm reading from my bit of paper now, has been described as autistic, the new astrology, econobabble, a dangerous pseudo-scientific zombie ideology, and its priests have been called econocrats. The Guardian economics correspondent Larry Elliott said once that, rewrote that, once the dust has settled, there's a strong case for an inquiry into whether the teaching of economics has been captured by a small but dangerous sect. No university would dream of teaching neoclassical astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, medicine, or psychology. Neoclassical economics remains the exception because its findings provide such a useful smokescreen for those who want their domination to continue. So when I dug into the anthropology of our behavior, which is really, there's only two things on this planet. There's nature and there's us beings. and there's us human beings and all the other beings, and we operate within nature. And when you go back into our human behavior, and we track back that we share 99% of our genes with the chimpanzees and the bonobos, and the chimpanzees operated in a very hierarchical, top-down, alpha male dominating way. The alpha male did 70% of all the mating. Everyone had to sort of be subdued by the alpha male. And that instinct to dominate still applies. We see friends trying to dominate. We see, when it's safely contained within a soccer team or a hockey team, that's all fine. But when it gets out of control and the Supreme President of the United States is an inherent dominator who wants to bully everyone else, we have trouble. So that regime continued until the hominids, or the descendants of the primates, developed both language and spears. So if you imagine that you're the big dominating alpha male and you're going to impose yourself with your fists and your teeth, but those of us who don't like being dominated, take one look at that, and we have a quick glance and we get our spears out and we kill you with a spear. And then we look at each other and say, well, who's the next alpha male? And we say, oh, not me. We know the game is over. And we're better off not having an alpha male. We're better off cooperating. And for 300,000 years, our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in a cooperative way of life, in which they did two things. They shared how they looked after each other. They shared the hunt. They shared the proceeds. They shared everything. And they took great care to suppress self-importance, because they knew that self-importance was a psychological gateway drug to domination. If you allowed a young man, he brings back he's killed a big mammoth and he drags it home, look what I've got. And they'd say, what a lousy bunch of scrappy, useless carcass you've got there. What value is that? They'd tease him and joke him, because they knew that if self-importance went to his head, he'd start pushing his weight around. And before you know what you've got rape, you've got murder, you've got mayhem. So they knew they had to suppress self-importance. So one of the fundamental findings here is that kindness flourishes in a society based on cooperation, when none of us are being jerks. None of us are trying to push each other around. And when we are being pushed around and when there is a dominator there, we instinctively feel resistance to that dominator. We don't feel so kind because so much of our attention is with, don't tell me what to do. We see that among the vaccine deniers right now, to whom this has gone to their heads, right? And so it struck me, right, that the fundamental dynamic in the whole economy and in all human existence is not between left wing and right wing, whether you have more private enterprise or more government. Of course, you have a healthy mixed economy, you have both. The fundamental distinction is between domination and cooperation. So the era of the hunter-gatherers came to an end when we started getting enough food surpluses, either to develop agriculture, or when we're coming down the west coast of North America and the beaches are so full of seafood and there's abundance of food that privately within the clan, we can think, I can keep some of this for my family. I'll just hide it under the, I'll keep it away. And so some families would start to be more successful than others. And that they say, well, that's my stream for hunting in. I'll keep that one for fishing in rather. But even then, for 5,000 years, the anthropologists tell us that there were a period of what we call achievement societies, when cultures were achieving things and building up wealth within the family, but still acting cooperatively. The critical threshold came when those achievement families, the successful ones, said, I want my children to inherit what I have built up. And with inheritance, suddenly the children have this big advantage in advance. And it was game over for the cooperators. I mean, it's also the fact that we're now living in bigger communities when it's tougher to know what each one is doing. So then we enter the age of domination again. Kings, princes, emperors, priests, tyrants, the works. The whole of human history for the last 10,000 years is a cascade of both their achievements and their brutalities coming out of domination. The interesting thing is that the impulse to cooperate never went away. It was always there among women and their children. You cannot do childbirth without other women to help you. You cannot raise children without people to help you. And yet even in raising children, you'll see that the dominating parental impulse coming in, who will happily bully their children, demand that their daughters do this or demand that their sons do that. So we've still got that tension going on. But still, most communities have some annual tradition of we'll all chip in and we'll do things together and we'll work together. But in the very the very core of the market economy is cooperative. You can't trade from Venice to China all the way along the Great Silk Road with a huge amount of trust and cooperation, because domination was perceived to be tied to untrustworthiness, because the dominator is going to try and cheat you. And if you're a cheat, no one's going to trade with you. So the market economy itself is inherently cooperative. But when we come up to the sort of 1700s with the Enlightenment and the process like that, so on the one hand, we started getting more distant from nature, and our belief that we could dominate nature and harvest and do it all and destroy nature became a bigger part of our way of thinking. On the other hand, out of the brutalities of that period and the horrible industrial conditions, people started forming workers' cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, community banks, community credit unions and cooperatives, public banks, and a parallel economy began to establish in which people were setting up the core foundations of an economy based on cooperation. So in Germany, the first public banks were established in the 1830s, 1840s, coming out of the terrible decade when there was the Irish potato famine and stuff like that. By the 1890s, they had thousands of public banks. Even to this day in Germany, 60% of all banking is either handled by public banking or cooperative banking, which is pretty much unknown in North America. Apart from out here in Vancouver, we have Van City Savings Credit Union, which is a very successful cooperative bank. And public banking can create money, the same as private banking create money. So all these institutions have developed. And it's just fascinating how it all pieces together. So I'm going to do another bit of screen share with you. I'm basically saying the old paradigm of economic thinking is completely screwed. It's faulty. It's not bringing us any new insights. It's leading us astray. It basically says that everything in the market economy is good and everything outside is an externality. So nature is an externality. The climate crisis, the toxification of our bodies by chemicals, the biodiversity crisis, the affordable housing crisis. These are unfortunate externalities that don't fit into the laws of economics. So when we look at an economy, what is that economy really? And I'll just go to this. So an economy, there are 5 enfolded economies. There's nature's economy. This is the core and beginning and end of everything. We are absolutely beholden to nature. Every one of us is breathing right now. Without that air, we can't do anything. Then we have personal agency. So we are free then to act within nature's economy, and we choose how we act. Do we act with dominating impulses or cooperative impulses? We then act within the social economy, which is when we do trade and exchange with each other without money. Very much the household economy. If you want to realize how important the social economy is, imagine running a business when none of your employees have been toilet trained, because all that stuff happens in the social economy. They're supporting each other, all the things we know that happen. They are reciprocal trades and arrangements, but they're critically important. The next realm of action is the community economy, when we're acting using money now within our community, where because we know the people in our community, we are bonded by reciprocal altruism. We know that we need to be kind to people for them to be kind to us. And typically, most of the new innovations around are happening in the community economy: cooperatives, community banks, agricultural hubs, community farm shows, all that sort of stuff. They're happening in the community economy where people are caring for each other. Next is the market economy, where we're using money now, but in an impersonal way. Now, inherently, it is still inherently cooperative, but it can be abused. And then we have the public economy, when the government gets involved to sort of try and make sense of all this stuff. So every economy throughout the whole world is that nested set of pieces, and it makes real sense when you think about it that way. But they're all under invasion by what I call the war economy, which is not the economy of tanks and missiles. It's the economy of aggressive desire to dominate. The people who see everything as an opportunity to bully, to get ahead personally, whether it's on the playground, whether it's a father who demands that his daughters must do this or that or the other, or in the market economy when he's cheating on people, or in the public economy when they're trying to rig a public contract. And then those around in the new paradigm, if you go to 1 o'clock, the new paradigm says nature matters, climate matters, Personal agency matters. You've got to turn your head upside down now. Values matter. Like, what do we believe in? Power matters, which is ignored by neoclassical economics. Energy matters, which is also ignored by neoclassical economics. People matter. Money matters. The social economy matters. The community economy, market economy, public economy. And so we have this. We can build a new ecological civilization, but we have simultaneously to resist domination. That's the important thing. Almost all of the books and the things that I read that are so full of ideas about how we can build a new world ignore the questioning is, why is it that people continue to behave badly? Why is it that we continue to have, vulture equity funds in America, private equity funds that will stripping corporations and ruining them and stuff like that? And that is the impulse to dominate. So restoring if we're restoring kindness, we have to simultaneously control that impulse. So the exciting thing here is that you can apply this mind frame to every realm of activity now, whether it's housing, governance, climate, biodiversity, all that stuff. Before I do that, though, I want to pick up on one further piece of economic history, because there was another paradigm of economics that appeared in between Adam Smith and the neoclassical economics in the 1890s, and that was socialist economics. So during the 1800s, there wasn't a term called economics, it was called political economy. And everyone knew that politics and power was part of the discussion. And there was so much struggle and exploitation going on that long before Karl Marx came along, there was a form of socialism and even of communism which said, we need to stop the industrialists controlling everything, and if we working people somehow get control and run our own world, everything will be fine. And out of that came both the impulse to start all the cooperatives with rules of regulation among themselves, but also Marx took a hold of this and he said that when he looks at the laws of history through a class perspective, it is self-evident that capitalism is destined to collapse under the contradictions built into capitalism, that the working proletariat, if they can have power, will be able to create a world free of all problems, a kind of socialist utopia. And he basically said, all the badness of the world goes to nasty bourgeois capitalists, and all the goodness of the world is to wonderful working people in the proletariat. And history is destined that this is going to be the case. God isn't. It's more than God is on our side. The whole of history is on our side. So people really believe this because they really wanted to believe there was a way out of the miseries of life in the brutal factories of the dirty industrial age and the exploitation with people working, 16-hour days, children, 10-year-olds working down the coal mines, that kind of stuff. And they wanted to believe that, but the Marxist economic paradigm is based on a complete fabulation of a myth that there are such things as economic laws or laws of history. And alas, when we had the communist revolution, poor old Lenin and Stalin must have been, Lenin must have been quite surprised when he discovered that people weren't all cooperative. The impulse to dominate was just as strong among the working proletariat as it was among the capitalists. And lo and behold, they revealed Stalin, who was the ultimate dominator, who killed millions in order to sort of impose the domination of the Communist Party. So that, and one of the reasons why the neoclassical economists wanted to establish neoclassical economics was to get rid of all that discussion around power and conflict. They said, if we can prove that economics is a science that follows the laws of science, then we'll be like the physicists, because this is the 1800s, they just discovered, we've got gravity, we've got Newton, we've got electromagnetism, all these amazing things that science had discovered. So they wanted to turn economics into a science. And for that, they had to have a human who always behaved like an atom, the Homo economicus, they called him, who was always self-interested and rational, which is, of course, complete nonsense. So they were in part trying to suppress the socialist impulse to justice and equality, because the impulse behind socialism and communism is, come on, you guys, this isn't fair. It's the cooperative way of thinking that we need to be kind to each other. So two things here. One is that component by component, you can apply this new way of thinking to housing, to banking, to central banking, to every component of the economy. And you have to consciously bring nature into the picture. And nature has to have a voice at the table, whether it's through a law to prevent ecocide or people who represent nature on the board of corporations. And we need to transform how every business operates. And then we have to try and do this within a 10-year timeframe because of the urgency of this time. So if I just sort of quickly jump on business, because business is the core piece of our economy. And part of the principles of a cooperative economy in kindness is that you respect human agency. You actually think human agency is brilliant. When we all love the freedom to do this and to do that and to act on our own impulses. And none of us like being told what to do, but we get used to it sometimes. So agency is really important. But in business, what's happened is that businesses have locked onto this neoclassical idea that their only purpose is to maximize profit for the shareholder. And that is, in some countries, written into corporate law. In other countries, it's an assumed thing. So in a 10-year transition, we need to develop a full expectation by law that every business must adopt a social purpose charter in which they state, this is our social purpose. This is what we're trying to do in the world. And we need to make a profit while doing it, because if we make a loss, we're in trouble. And we also will be required to have all larger corporations to allow labor unions, to have 50% of the seats on the board given to the workers in the factory, in the plant, in the business. For the larger corporations, so to have a representative of the public on the board, representing the public interest and nature, to have up to 50% women on the board of directors, and to sort of report annually on not just on financial progress, but on progress in reducing the climate pollution, in reducing harm to biodiversity, in becoming a circular economy, all that other kind of stuff, in reducing toxic chemicals. And any business, if you can get this through Parliament, if a political party will say, this is what we need to do, after that 10-year period, any business that has not changed its charter will not be allowed to operate. Simple as that. You're not playing by the rules of the game. It's like if you hold a house party and someone's really misbehaving, you give them a warning, then you throw them out. Interesting thing is that same process can be applied to banking. So every bank can create money out of thin air. That's how money is created. It's created out of sheer trust. Only sort of 2 or 3% is the actual coins that are printed by the Mint or the Central Bank of Canada. But that money is created as reciprocal trust, which is why you have to repay it. A public bank can do the same. A public bank can create money out of trust, but it does not need to charge interest on it. It just needs to charge enough fees to cover its operating costs. The Public Bank of North Dakota, which has been operating since 1920, is the most successful bank in North America. It creates money, uses it to support farmers, students, businesses in North Dakota. It funnels its money through community banks, and it's been successful for all that time. And now there's a big movement to restore public banking right across America. The same principle, so just stay with public banking for a minute. In Germany, one of their big public banks called KfW is the main source of financing for affordable housing and for housing retrofits to reduce climate pollution and for wind and solar installations. You don't have to have the money in advance to invest in those things. If you're a bank, you can create it out of pure trust that it'll be repaid by the proceeds of that activity. In the normal political debate that we're in the middle of right now with an election, everyone assumes that if you're spending money on this stuff, you're having to borrow it and you've got to raise taxes to pay it back. It is just not true. Canada can establish a public bank distinct from its central bank and generate that money for every investment that can get and render a return. So it can create the money for all the affordable housing we need. In addition, if housing providers, I'm now talking on the housing crisis a little bit, which is outrageously awful for those who are on the wrong side of the housing crisis. At the moment, if you assume the market is going to provide affordable housing, and if you have someone that's a corporation says, we're going to build affordable housing for rent, and your shareholders have a choice between renting those properties at $700 a month or at $2,000 a month, they're all going to vote for $2,000. They're all going to vote to get as much rent as they can out of the people they're renting to, because that's their purpose financially. The funds they get the money from all want to maximize their return. But if you remove for-profit housing from the market entirely, by only allowing development to be done by non-profits, housing cooperatives, municipalities, non-profit agencies, and that you require all the land they acquire to be put into a community land trust when it's taken off the market forever, the people, those units can be built with money created by a public bank, because the rents and the returns will cover that. But after 25 years, when you've repaid the cost of building and the land, your non-profit housing is the same status as anyone who's paid off a mortgage. You only have to now cover repairs, maintenance, insurances, and taxes, municipal taxes. And so you could, in this, using the economics of kindness, you could eliminate the entire concept of rent. But in 25 years, there wouldn't be anyone renting at all, if, except, if you choose to rent because you for whatever reason. But among the affordable housing, those who need affordable housing, they would no longer be trapped into paying exorbitantly high rents to private, property owners or capitalists or equity funds who are just doing it to make money. We could transform the whole housing market, and every one of those houses can be built as a passive house that needs no external source of heat, no gas, no oil, just the building design itself can work this way. And everything I talked about is being done in different communities around the world already. In the year 1900, when Zurich had a housing crisis, the city government reduced finance at zero interest, and they lent it to housing cooperatives. And something like 60% of the housing in Zurich today is now managed by affordable housing cooperatives. In Sweden in the 1970s, when there was a housing crisis, the government itself enabled non-profits to build, I think it was however million units of housing for a small country, but they did it all in 10 years, much far higher level of housing than anyone is doing now in Canada, America, or wherever, or Britain. And so we can solve the housing crisis that way. We can change the nature of business. If we look at the climate crisis, we have to do two things. We can invest in the necessary solutions, whether it's building retrofits, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, solar panels, wind turbines. They all render a financial return. You can use public financing for those to the extent that the private financing is not available. And you then have to look at the existing companies that are committed to burning fossil fuels. They want to expand the use of natural gas or oil and build pipelines. And you've got to remember that the only way to get a cooperative society is to suppress domination. So you have to be willing to bring in regulations and get every municipality to sign a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, to get a sign-off date for the expansion on fossil fuels, which the Liberals have just promised by 2025. And so slowly but if you're going to close down the oil industry in Alberta, but you say to all the workers, we can generate a guaranteed income for everyone working on the oil sands in the oil sector. There's so much work to be done in installing solar and wind and building retrofits and changing to organic farming, which needs more people than regular conventional farming, that everyone can be given a guaranteed career transition path. So then the resistance is going to be far less. Something like 70% of the oil sands workers say, I'd love to work. I'd love to work in something not based on that. If I jump to the global level, because I know time's running out of me here, take world trade, which seems like an amorphous big thing that we're all controlled by. Right now, if you don't have total free trade, you use tariffs and to control trade. If you look at things through a cooperative lens, you still use tariffs, but you impose a tariff against any trading partner who has not signed the climate agreements, the biodiversity agreements, the fair trade for workers agreements, the reduced toxic chemicals agreements. And that you prejudice against them because they're not playing by the new rules of the global game. You're creating new rules for the whole global cooperative economy, which express the needs of people cooperatively and not the needs of private corporations. So you need to actually close down the World Trade Organization and open up a new United Nations Fair Trade Organization with different trading rules. And it can start between individual countries. So there's no reason why, Finland and Denmark and Costa Rica and New Zealand and, could not start trading together on those terms. And then you build the number of countries involved in that. So that you're expanding the circle of kindness and trade out of the exploitative, cruel, very manipulative circle of trade that happens at the moment. And there are so many realms that this goes into. I mean, I haven't got time to go into the restoring of manufacturing, into sort of how you can use taxes to sort of to support more cooperative development. But let me touch on one last thing, which is central banking. Central banks also create money. To understand the origins of money, let's imagine that all of us on this call are sitting around the campfire. I see we're about 50 people. It's good size of a clan. And I'm thinking proudly, Norbert, he sharpened my spear for me the other day. I owe him one, right? And Peter cooked this phenomenally good meal for me. I owe him one. So I'm carrying invisible debt in my mind, and I know that I need to repay them. If I counted, I owed Norbert 3 units and Peter 6 units, that's money. That's how money starts, based on the trust that I will repay that gift. That's reciprocal trust. Now, in the same tribe, if we imagine that Janet over there is really elderly and she's struggling and she's looking down at heel and she needs a feast in her honor, we will give that feast to her without expectation of return. We're giving it as a gift money for the benefit of the whole tribe. That is what central banks do when they create money. If you create too much of that money, you get inflation, monetary financial inflation. If you do too much giving with that's not reciprocal in the clan, you'll get inflation of expectations. And people think, well, maybe I can get some of that gift money without having to pay it back. So the same thing applies. So here's the interesting thing, that when the central banks have used their power to create money, for instance, to bail out the banks in the 2008 crisis, and to support the stock market in the current COVID crisis. So get me right here, in America, the Federal Reserve has been creating money to buy challenged stocks owned by big corporations, giving them more money, causing their stock market value to increase, on the assumption that the only thing that matters in the economy is the stock market. So if you wonder why the Wall Street, the Dow Jones has gone from 19,000 points in 2019 to 36,000 points in 2021 during the pandemic, is because the central bank has been using its power to create money to help them. Because central bankers have grown up thinking they're part of the clan of bankers, not the clan of everyone. If a central banker is part of the clan of everyone, and they need to stimulate an economy that's really struggling, they could create money directly to build affordable housing. So a government could dream up affordable housing bonds. The central bank would buy them off them, giving them $10 billion or whatever, which the government would then spend, and it would go straight into the market in the form of wages for builders, painters, decorators, plumbers, electricians. What happened during the 2008 crisis, when the central banks wanted to stimulate a collapsing economy, they said, we'll give the money to the banks will lend it to businesses, and the businesses will create the jobs. The trouble was that the businesses didn't want to borrow because they were nervous about the market. The banks were much more happy to lend it into the property market. They poured the money into the property market, where it caused inflation, which is one of the prime causes of the housing crisis today, why the prices have gone up so much. And realized that they called it quantitative easing. You can have people's quantitative easing. You can use central banking to tackle any emergency, but only emergency, not for any other purpose. You can't use it for general healthcare spending, but climate emergency, biodiversity emergency, affordable housing crisis, you can use central bank financing in a cooperative economy to tackle those things and allow kindness to infiltrate throughout those massive problem areas where there's more kindness for the people struggling with housing, or the people or nature itself in the climate crisis. So I have a little switch on my back, and it talks for 10 hours unless you switch it off. So I'm going to literally lean over and switch that off and open this up for questions and discussions, because otherwise I'll go on until it's midnight.
Thank you so much for that, Guy. That was really fantastic. I want to encourage everybody to put their questions in the chat, and Guy will begin to address them. I have some broad questions to kick us off, but actually, since you just ended on the note of inflation, I thought I would just ask for your comment that today Canada's inflation rate hit its highest level in 18 years. Oh, this is last month. So what exactly do you think about immediate actions? How does the economics of kindness begin to address this imminently? Because
there's two, I mean, none of the economists know how to deal with inflation until you understand it. In the 1970s, when we had inflation, people assumed that it was caused by monetarist policy. And actually it was caused by the increased price of oil, which like quadrupled and filtered through the whole economy. So you've got to sort out how much of today's inflation is being caused by the use of central bank financing to support COVID checks, the CERB checks and those checks going on, and how much is caused by the housing crisis, by the use of the inflation of the housing market and the increasing price of rents, and how much is other quirky stuff like why is food increasing in price? Is it because there are particular shortages? And so you've got to break it down into particular pieces like that. And I don't know enough about the pieces. I haven't seen any economist who has done a good enough analysis except around housing. And when it's clear that the housing price inflation is clearly being caused by far too much money pouring into the housing market. And specifically in Germany, for instance, the banks are not allowed to lend more than the rental value of property. And we should suppress, foreign buying. We should suppress. We've got to look at inheritances, because so much of the money coming through inheritances is being poured, coming out of the property market and being poured back into it, and people are buying more property with their inheritances, which benefits the 70% who have property and really screws those who don't. So there's not a simple one-off answer to that, but we do need to worry that too much central bank created money to deal with COVID may be behind it, because when you've got too much money in the economy, prices will rise. But until we get better analysis, I don't know the answer. Yeah.
And that kind of goes to the first question I had prepared for you. So how will this collaborative economic model then support better climate governance at the global scale? And do you envision any role of larger bodies like the United Nations in bringing this culture, globally?
I think that everyone who's involved in the COP26 treaties is trying to do exactly that. That's the treaty. They're going to have the discussions in Glasgow in the end of November. The trouble is that the Paris Climate Treaty it's entirely voluntary. If you missed your targets, it doesn't matter. If you have a trade agreement and you break that trade agreement, you're taken to court and you get, here's $1 billion fine. So there are strict penalties. So we need to move from voluntary measures to regulatory measures to tackle the climate crisis. So instead of saying, oh, here's an encouragement to buy an electric car, you pass laws that saying by 2030, every new vehicle must be electric. And governments are beginning to do that all around the world. You pass laws saying that no new house can be fitted with natural gas starting in 1 year's time. It's totally unneeded that any house invests in fossil fuels when we don't need them at all. And then you pass regulations. A central bank can do something called credit guidance. It can actually pass rules on what banks can create money for. This was used really successfully after World War II by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and then China, who emphasized money creation for exports and not for internal consumption, because they had to get exports to earn foreign exchange to be able to build their internal economies. Central banks could issue credit guidance saying you're not allowed to invest, to create money, to expand fossil fuels. That's within our power. The equivalent is imagine it's 1940 in Britain. We're at war with Germany. And a British bank is financing a company that's selling tanks to the Germans. And immediately it's unthinkable. Like, you can ban that kind of behavior. And then I'll have a joke here, the net zero emissions thing from 2050, that's like a British company. Well, we're selling tanks to the Germans, but for every tank we sell them, they're going to bury one tank. So it doesn't matter really. It's just how it's a bunch of craziness. But we need to move to the regulatory realm. And ideally, we need to get that into global regulations as well. But that's a highly controversial thing, because no countries are yet in the position where they want to be told what to do by other countries. European Union is the only cluster of nations where they agree to abide by shared regulations. So we need to expand that model. So just last week I heard that Costa Rica and Denmark have signed a joint non-fossil fuel proliferation treaty together, not to invest any more in fossil fuel expansion. It's not that Costa Rica's got any, but so yeah, I mean, I see a little comment saying we need a ministry of the future that can, we need actually young people sitting at every table.
Yeah.
We need to have votes for 16-year-olds, and 80-year-olds should say, I'm going to vote on behalf of someone younger. But every 16-year-old needs to be voting clearly. Yeah. That more questions.
I spent some. Yes, I want to move on to another question from a participant. This one from Janet Dennison. Guy, you talked about the importance of innovation, and I want to ask how would you encourage innovation in this new economy?
It's through agency. I've been self-employed all my life, and my wife Carolyn has too, and I see the way in which we just create things. You dream it up out of your imagination and you make it happen. Everyone in business knows what that's about. When you work too long in an oppressive job where someone else is the boss, you slowly lose agency and you lose the ability to think for yourself and to act for yourself. So the glory of agency is that people, and especially young people, dream up stuff. Our imagination is fertile. So there's that Dutch teenager, I've forgotten his name, but when he was 17-year-old, he was appalled by plastic pollution in the ocean. He said, I'm going to solve that problem. And over about 8 years now, he's got to the stage when they're out in the Pacific with a new machine, collecting plastics and getting it out of the ocean. He was a 17-year-old when he started that. And so innovation is natural to anyone with imagination. What we need to do is in our community economies, find ways to support that. So if someone wants to start a business or a cooperative, there are mentors to help them. There are support systems. There's free rental in older accommodation. Whatever it is, we nurture dreams among our youngsters. We give them grants, we give them scholarships. We have free public education throughout our college system. So they're not coming out of college burdened with massive big student loans. In innovation, you don't need to do anything to let innovation blossom. You just need to let it blossom on its own. Because people are so distressed by the crises in the world, they're already thinking up and dreaming all these ways of making a difference. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question goes to sort of the realisticness. You know, there's a lot of climate denialism, and in fact, at the debate, a statistic was said that one of every 4 Canadians don't believe that climate change is caused by human-caused activity.
Yeah.
So, do you truly believe it's possible to transition off of fossil fuels within the next 10 years?
No, but by 2040 it's possible, within the next 20 years. There are structural things that it's really tough to do it in 10 years. The flip side of that is 75% of the people do know that the climate crisis is real. And every year they're getting more freaked out. Every year the floods, the fires, the smoke, the droughts are getting more impactful. We have a phenomenal drought in Madagascar right now. We have a famine coming up in Kenya. Australia will now be moving into its fire season. We just had a horrible fire season in British Columbia. So ordinary people who don't understand the climate crisis know that things are really going bad. So they're more willing to vote for politicians who say, do stuff and do stuff and do stuff. And when you do public polling on the actual solutions, as Seth Klein did in his book called The Good War, he's comparing the need to handle climate crisis the same way as we did World War II, you got numbers in 70–80% in support of more solar, in support of building retrofits, in support of wind energy, in support of winding down the fossil fuel industry. There's not a problem with public support. Interestingly, when you survey people about their values, and the Common Cause Foundation in Britain has done this, up to 75% of people want to live by cooperative values of caring and supporting each other, and 25% prefer to live by values of status and importance, and where they are on the pecking order and stuff like that. Which kind of measures there are 25% of Canadians who are hardcore conservative or PCC voters, who are really thinking about their own taxes, think after myself, stop regulating me, don't tell me what to do with my guns, don't tell me what to do with vaccines. But it's only 25%. A huge majority is thinking cooperative, is thinking rationally, and wants more kindness in the world.
So thank you. That was an excellent answer. I wanted to bring it to this because it kind of speaks to the different cultures. I'm really glad you hit on the cultures. So how does the economic economics of kindness prevail in a world that's dominated by special interests that are entirely opposed to a shift in the status quo, as well as people who don't belong to this status quo, who buy into this culture of domination, as you've so eloquently put it?
So there's two parts to that. So in America, starting in the 1970s, the Coke industry people, Koch brothers and others, put huge amounts of money into manipulating the public discourse to believe that the problem was the government. So Reagan came along and said, trust me with the government. Yes, the worst word you'd ever heard. So people have been led to believe that the government's the cause of all their problems. The real power behind the throne is the special interests, in terms of the financial special interests, who want nothing more than to get rich, to become the upper class, to dominate. And it's straight out of the old rule book. I mean, the dominating behavior of some of those alpha males is just as, you can't, it's straight there. I mean, Trump is the perfect embodiment of that pure domination impulse. And there's no way to overcome that apart from resisting it, whether it's in the streets, in massive protests, in protesting the banks, in getting the insurance companies to stop backing. Chubb Insurance recently said, we're not going to bank any more tar sands projects at all. We won't give them insurance. And then turning the public will into regulation. In the 1930s, when President Roosevelt was trying to stop the power of the big banks, they hated him. They hated what he was doing. They hated him allowing labor unions to have strength. He hated them breaking up the banks so that the ordinary banks couldn't speculate in the market. And for that reason, there was no financial crisis for 25, 30 years, 40 years. As soon as the banks, they wanted to be able to create money out of thin air and speculate to make profits. And we're the suckers who lose that. You've got to suppress that by regulation. And you've got to have the public will behind that, which means you've got to have political parties who understand this and put that in their political platforms and bring it to parliament and vote it through. There's no other game in town. That is how we express power in a democracy. And then you have public education to help the people who've been sucked into dark rabbit holes of believing in conspiracy nonsense, fueled by those very dominators. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been definitely thinking a lot about the fact we live in the information age throughout your talk, and how it can sway that kind of culture and bring more people in. This question comes from the president of the WFMC, Walter Dorn. And he says, as World Federalists, we think a lot about the institutions of global governance. We need institutions to hold governments and corporations to account and to the new rules. Otherwise, the selfish take advantage of the kind. I did hear you talk about a UN Fair Trade org. Have you solved the enforcement problem?
The enforcement would come at the national level if you've got countries that are it's already showing up with what's called carbon border adjustments, where the discussion is one country's got a high carbon tax, as Canada will have soon, and another country has got a zero carbon tax, and they're importing stuff that has not paying its carbon dues. You impose a border carbon tariff adjustment. So you're putting a tariff onto those imported goods based on their carbon footprint with an assumed carbon tax. You can do the same for countries that are not signing human rights agreements, that are not signing a global treaty on ecocide, that are not respecting labor unions, all that kind of stuff. But it does require a government regulatory ability to do that. And that in turn means that when a government sends delegates to a trade conference, the terms of reference for the delegation should go before Parliament first to be debated in public so that the delegates know what their purpose is. Otherwise, what's happening by default is that economists go to those trade talks or schooled in neoclassical economics who assume the market knows best and they're just reading out of the same old script. It's like having a multi-religious conference in the 1700s and you can't think freely because your Catholic priests have been told you're only allowed to think what the Pope tells you, even though your country's gone Protestant. So you've got to restore democracy before people enter trade agreements and other global level negotiations. Like when you go to the G20, the Parliament itself should be discussing what are the pieces that the government's putting on the table at a G20 treaty. The federal piece, I believe, will be built up by if you imagine we have a G20 at the moment, we could have a green 20 or a G50 of 50 nations which signed on to strong action on the climate crisis and strong action on the biodiversity crisis. And they agree to help each other, to cooperate, to share stuff, this, the other. And other countries will gradually join and they'd have trading advantage among themselves and they'd support each other in all sorts of ways, right?
Yeah, let's bring it back to the climate, because I think that a big part of the global institutions you've mentioned, these agreements and, norms of international relation kind of positioning these countries where they kind of need to. So this question comes from Keith McNeil. What do you think of global carbon fee and dividend, charging a fee on fossil fuels, similar to a carbon tax, and distributing all of the proceeds to everyone as equal dividends, similar to universal basic income, and doing it on the global level?
On the global level is completely impossible at the moment. It is exactly what Canada is doing right now. We do have, our carbon tax is a carbon fee. The income is redistributed to everyone it's not equally distributed, it's distributed in favor of people on lower incomes who get more of the share of it. And it's the only thing is it's hidden away as a tax rebate, or actually I used to get a check sometimes for it, but I haven't seen it for a while. It's tucked away in taxes or whatever. If people got that as a check in the mail on their birthday, they would appreciate they're getting the money back. So it could contribute towards a basic income, but it's a fatal foundation for it, because if by 2040 we've eliminated fossil fuels, the carbon tax won't have any income whatsoever. So we have to think very differently around how we finance basic income. Globally, to impose a carbon tax would require such a high level of global taxation that you get so much right-wing jerkery and resistance, it'd be politically impossible, by people screaming their heads off that they were being exploited by the global cabal of reptile creatures from God knows where who control everything, right? So it's just pragmatically impossible at the moment. But the more countries do it, that's what matters. We need to sort out the global differential between nations by the Global Climate Fund, and each country's commitment to put in X billion dollars each year to transfer wealth from the wealthy nations to the Mozambiques and Kenyas of the world to help them both deal with the impacts and to invest in the transition for themselves. But we need to put China, India, and Indonesia at the top of the list of how we deal with this stuff, because those three countries are still investing in coal, still pouring coal stuff out, and their environmental movements are far weaker than they are in the developed world.
I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the development trajectory of those countries in particular, also the developing world. It's anticipated that urbanization is to be one of the defining themes of this century. The fact is, these places need to urbanize, but it's how they do it. How do you foresee this economics of cooperation helping on a global scale to bring about urbanization in places that need it? Will do it, but if done incorrectly, could lead to devastating pollution and massive slums.
So let me separate that into two pieces, because how do we spread the economics of kindness and cooperation to the developing world, or I now call it the global south? We're the wealthy world and there's the global south. One is not more developed than the other. And the urban thing is different. So if you look at the developing world nations, there are some that are still run by tyrannical oligarchies, where wealthy families, whether it's in Belarus or Angola or Niger, completely control the show. And first of all, you've got to build enough community strength to get proper democracy. There are other nations like El Salvador and Nicaragua where powerful families run the show, which is almost mafiosi in the way of their dominating the show. The places around the world where you've got successful examples of a cooperative economy are all where women are being respected and have autonomy and have power. So India, in Kerala, the Kudumbrashi movement, which is vast village and urban development movement in Kerala, led by village assemblies and urban assemblies where people meet together, decide what their needs are, do the investment, start the farms, start the businesses, and it's all structured right up to the state level. The same happens with the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which started on the very similar principles, been phenomenally successful. The Sekem movement outside Cairo is a whole little network of cooperative social enterprises producing biodynamic and organic goods and stuff like that on the same principles. And in the Rojava area of northern Syria, where the Kurds have established an independent place, they're using the same principles there as well. But it's imperative that women have a key role to play. So throughout almost all of Africa, it's assumed that men run the show. And that it's very difficult to get the wisdom of women in when men assume they run the show and women's voice doesn't count for anything. So this means it's not a quick process. I mean, It's not a 10-year transition in most of the developing world because you've got a lot of ancient prejudices to overcome. And in India, the entire caste system, where everyone's assigned to a caste, plays against the economics of kindness. You've got to have enough cooperative resistance to overcome that. So the resistance movement, whether it's against pipelines or against oppression or Black Lives Matter or Indigenous Lives Matter, is a hugely important part of the restoration of a cooperative economy and bringing kindness back to overcome domination. Because we've grown up in 10,000 years of domination, and that domination puts Black people at the bottom of the pile, it puts immigrants at the bottom of the pile, it puts Mexicans, and even working class people who have been oppressed by their capitalist bosses. They want to feel self-important, so they then bully people who are they believe they can bully, right? The typical bully in the playground is feeling inwardly insecure. Probably got parents who are bullying him, so he will bully someone else on the playground who's weaker. That's where that impulse to bully, it's never going to go away. It'll still be there in 100,000 years' time, but we need to learn how to suppress it and keep it under control.
So on that note of bullies in the international world, and a little bit on the military-industrial complex. We have a question from Furquan Galin, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who wants us to take into consideration the global military-industrial complex, and especially their role in being major polluters. You've talked about how this urge to dominate will not be going away. So how do you foresee the role of our military around the world shifting, or do they not? Does money remain where it is, directed towards them, or does it?
No, this is a really important question. Let me just give you some numbers here. In 2021, violence and war cost the world $15 trillion, or $2,000 per person. 43% of that was for military expenditure, 39% for internal security. And we're spending 100 times more money waging war than we are waging peace. So if we imagine that the governments of key countries, and Canada would be a prime candidate for that, would form a coalition of peacemaking countries committed to channeling as much investment money into mediation processes, in conflict resolution processes, in food security processes, because lack of food security is one of the triggers of war, and mediation processes. There's positive peacekeeping and negative peacekeeping. Negative peace is when people are just stop fighting and they're just grunting at each other. Positive peace is when they're trading together, they're working together, they're intermarrying, they're learning to love and respect each other. So building positive peace, if enough countries in the world said this is going to be our #1 priority for the next 50 years, and it's not just a peacekeeping mission, putting an army between two fighting sides. So that needs just one nation to set up the first global summit to start doing this and see who else comes to the table, to turn the table. And then if you imagine that you have successfully had that change in a corporate charter, so every business must become a social purpose business. The businesses whose trade is purely in selling armaments, making and selling armaments. We have to look at that because there's two things. First of all, you've got to stop that business operating as such. Secondly, you've got to take care of all its workers. So you've got to have a transition fund for the company to find those workers a new path in life. Now, if you look at Mondragon in northern Spain, in the Basque district of northern Spain, which is fully cooperative, with about 100,000 workers in cooperatives, as well as having a business, they have research and development divisions constantly dreaming up new ideas. So the businesses are all run and controlled by their workers, who know far more about how business works than any financial manager or equity fund manager or financial manipulator. They know the best way to improve the business, which is why having unions involved, which is the workers themselves, in managing the business has become so important. So every one of those companies, you empower the people making the armaments, who are engineers and technicians, like, what else could you make? How many of you want to work 4 days a week? How many of you want early retirement? Blah, blah, blah. You've got to finesse that transition on the assumption that we're going to systematically shut down the global arms industry, so that by the end of this, probably a 100-year process, we can eliminate all war from this planet by the end of this century. I say by 2050, if we set our minds to it, because that's such a grossly awful waste of resources, and the bitterness and misery and the pain and the cruelty that goes on with all that stuff. And now anonymous drones going out and do the killing. We are on the edge of having this discussion about a global treaty, at least to stop armed drones. Cutting little pieces, but I think that the crises of this decade are going to oblige us to start working together as nations in a much more dynamic way. But I haven't heard any of the political leaders in this federal campaign even talk about this kind of stuff. That's what's appealing.
I want to go to a
Go on.
related question is someone asked, how do we refuse that our tax dollar goes into waging war? And I want to just add, and possibly into peace. Is there a way you foresee this happening?
There have been, I've got gray hair now, so I've been through quite a lot, and I've observed movements to do this in the past, and they get very minor success. They never achieve very much. It's not an avenue of that I would personally go far down, because at the end of the day, you're legally obliged to pay taxes, and there are more impactful ways to put your activism. Given this, every one of us needs to become an activist for one specific cause. You're going to burn out if you try and do too many things at once. You choose that one particular cause and you really work on it. And I believe that developing, a consensus among a few nations to set up a global, a P20, like a Peace 20 group of nations, would work together to change the entire global mind frame around that. Is a better way to invest activism than not paying taxes, which is a purely personalized campaign. That's just my personal take on it. Yeah.
This question comes from Rose Dyson. She's a member of the board of the Toronto branch. Do you think effective government regulation will require better rules along the digital road to encourage the kindness and less polarization? We don't have to address the influence of algorithms in social media among, here, let me, sorry, this is very long. I think I didn't pause very well in the middle, but so basically to use technology to encourage kindness and less polarization.
I think I know what she's getting at. So we need more, I'm going to be funny here, more algorithm and less algorithms. You got me? Anyway, the digital communications realm is so brand new to us all. When the printing press really first got a hold, if you look at what happened in the 1700s in Britain, the pamphlets that were produced were outrageously slanderous and libelous and disgusting and gross. And the government brought in laws against libel and slander. They stopped it, right? The radio waves in Canada are really well regulated. In America, they passed an act, I think in 1980 or so, stripping regulation from the radio station, which allowed the hate jocks to spout nonsense and craziness all over the place because they're regulated, but they're only doing that because Americans under Reagan, I believe, scrapped the regulatory act, the control that brought civilization and decency to the airwaves. So you need to regulate the digital media. There's no question that its ability to spread abuse and lies and hatred is harmful to all of us. It's just how we got to find ways to do that. It's not self-regulation. Facebook's sort of board of self-regulators. It's getting there, but we need top-down regulation. We need a digital tax, which has got a core component and an additional component, which is the accumulation of fines for allowing hate speech and absolute fraudulent nonsense to spread on the internet. If you imagine, someone said to me the other day, if you had the internet in the 1700s during the witch craziness, when people were being burnt for witchcraft and this internet to spread that, or even the 1980s when that stuff was going on in the prairies about the abuse in the childcare centers and the sexual abuse, which turned out to have no foundation at all, but it destroyed some people's lives. The power of the internet to exaggerate craziness is really dangerous for all of us. So we need to regulate it. Absolutely, yeah. That's not the same as censorship, but we do have censorship for some things. We already have Facebook has censorship against nudity. Nobody complains. We just need to, the public discourse needs to be respectful and well-informed. Yeah.
This question again comes from Janet Dennison. How do you stop the exploitative nature of a lot of government so-called aid? And I think just to point to a few, obviously there have been some very significant scandals in the past year. And so it's both sort of an issue of accountability and creating personnel and people of quality.
It's all about accountability and training. I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of private seniors' care homes. And clearly in Ontario, they were a disaster. In Australia, the private care homes had no increase in COVID because they're tightly regulated by the government. They'd have government inspectors arriving unannounced. In Ontario, from what I remember, you get 4 weeks notice that the government inspector's coming. So you put in a Potemkin village and make everything look clean and happy. And it's all about the quality of the civil service and that ethic of public service and good training for the staff to do that. Yeah, there's no shortcuts to that stuff. The same, obviously, corruption is given that a quarter of people are on the lookout for ways to advance themselves at the expense of other people. You've got to train the others to look out for incipient corruption, cheating, and it's always going to cripple up. You can, I mean, to sort of trickle up, I mean, you can take an ordinary condo association that's managing a condo, just a fully cooperative thing, and some retired accountant who's been in a government office wants to continue dominating everyone, and he drives everyone away and no one wants to sit because he's being a jerk. We have to learn to defend the economics of kindness against people who are more selfish and abuse it.
What do you think is the largest barrier to the economics of kindness today?
I believe understanding that most of us want to be kind, that we are kind in our behavior, that we are cooperative, that we want a world that way, and to disabuse ourselves of the belief that all humans are selfish and brutal. And to disabuse ourselves of the cynicism that comes from that the rich control the show, that nothing you can do, and that humans are inherently selfish and greedy. It is not true that humans are inherently selfish and greedy. It is true that we have an impulse within us to dominate if we can get away with it. But most people want to live cooperatively, they want to be kind to each other, and life is far more fun and happier when we do it that way. So believing in our ability to solve these problems is the biggest success we can get. And the biggest barrier is our belief that we can't solve them, which then goes to an even darker place of being cynical about whether we can solve them and people giving up. So in my game, it's not about whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. If you're watching the Blue Jays play in Toronto and they're losing hopelessly, you can be pessimistic, or you can be optimistic if they're winning like they are on the streak right now. But if you're a player on the field, you're either determined or defeated. And the coach is going to see if you're defeated and pull you. So the only game left for all of us who care is to be determined. And that's the end of the story. You keep on being determined until you achieve whatever you can. We're all going to die and be forgotten in 100 years' time. No one will know our names. If we do what we can now, it's the biggest gift we can give to the future.
Speaking of the future, and you mentioned before the role of young people, the housing market being a specific sensitive spot. I just saw a comment from Valea Dark talking about the need to teach children critical thinking skills, and I want you to elaborate on the role you think the next generation has in bringing about the economics of kindness. Have you seen things that give you hope?
Well, I see young people inherently wanting to be kind to the earth and wanting to do stuff creatively, but they haven't done enough 6 years of reading economics to get behind the full story behind the whole thing. But if we take the housing crisis, for instance, and if we count young as being up to 35, the only thing that ended phenomenal worker exploitation in the 1840s to 1890s is forming a trade union and being willing to go on strike and negotiate and hold your force together. If you take a community of people where everyone in the downtown business is earning 15 to 20 bucks an hour, they're renting, they're struggling on the housing market, but the whole economy is based on them. If those people would form an affordable housing alliance and work together and say, these are the solutions that are needed, and we are going to go on strike Saturday morning for an hour and withdraw our labor entirely. And if you don't get it together, then next week it'll be 2 weeks. Next week it'll be 3 weeks, 2 hour strike, then 3 hour strike. The people who run those businesses are going to be phoning the politicians and saying, fix this thing. Our workers need a place to live that they can afford to live in. It's outrageous that, if I just give my workers a $5 an hour wage increase, so for 40 hours they earn an extra $200, and the landlord increases their rent by $500 a month, I just give them all that wage increase straight to the landlord. It is wrong. It is really wrong. But the trouble is that 70% of people own property. Every MP owns property. Every MLA, every MPP, every city councillor, they own property. So the people who are renting have no voice politically unless they organize to make it happen. So I visualize a worldwide affordable housing alliance with a chapter in every city working together and using this tactics of mobilization to force the issue onto those who are comfortable because we own our own properties and we're comfortable, who cares? Because the squeaky wheel is the only thing that gets attention. So it really is up to young people to mobilize together to tackle that housing crisis and to sort of bring some strength to the table, because they cannot depend on the property owners to solve it for them, because the property owners are getting richer every year with the inflating prices. They have to mobilize and organize.
I want to I'm going to get to questions in the chat, but this makes me think of a question that came up again in the federal election debate last Thursday. And it was positioned, I think, to Jagmeet Singh, and it was sort of the idea that you can either allow young people into the housing market, or older people who have their wealth invested in their homes have now depend on it for the retirement. And for those who exist in the medium realm, who have debts accumulating, perhaps due to COVID, perhaps due to other circumstances, they now rely on this money. And the question was sort of positioned as either young people or those who have their investments in real estate. And I want to know your thoughts on that.
I heard that question. I heard Jagmeet's answer as well. So the people who own property, the house that 5 years ago was worth 500,000 is now worth $1 million. They had sufficient security 5 years ago when it was worth 500,000. They now want to hang on to that extra 500,000, and it's not taxed. So there should be, for starters, for all second properties, when everyone owns a second house, any capital gains increase on that house should be taxed at 100% to stop speculation and people. As a property owner, I have a line of credit. I can borrow $300,000 without asking a soul and put it towards another house. And if it's got a rental unit, I can buy another property with that and get richer at their expense. So it's those who own property need to realize that we're floating on this great bubble of value that was not there 5 years ago. And it's going to fall. It needs to fall. It needs to stop rising. There are some people who bought at the very top of the bubble who are going to be hurting. Yeah, there's going to be a problem for some, and that may be a special case for a small percentage where you look at ways to help them if they're really struggling, like tax relief, something municipal, whatever it is. But the majority of people are not struggling. They're just sitting there laughing all the way to bank about the increased value of their properties. While the 30% who are looking upwards, the hope of ever buying has vanished. And then the rental prices are going up as well. So I think it's very selfish to assume that all property owners don't care about their own children and grandchildren. They all, 90% of property owners have children or grandchildren, and it's their interests they got to care about as well. We need to be called out on that, and not have the bumper sticker saying, "Oh, I'm spending my children's inheritance. Look at me, isn't that fun, right?"
I'm glad you got to that point as well. And even when you brought up women before, I was thinking about, this generation's birth rate declining because there's that vulnerability. You don't know where you're going to be living. And so having the wealth remain in one portion of the population doesn't really do much to bring about the next generation.
That's atrocious, yeah. We need a new social contract. We developed a social contract in 1945 when the welfare state came in with unemployment pay, sickness pay, public housing, public healthcare, all those other good things. And now we got a whole new generation that's really struggling. A new social contract would be guaranteed right to an affordable home through the mechanism I laid out earlier. And furthermore, it would put a tax on inheritances. And 100% of the money from taxing the wealthy will be placed into giving every 18-year-old a gift between $20,000 and $80,000. So when they come of age, there's wealth transfer. It's taxed, so the wealthy kids, they pay in taxes. And whether or not that money has no strings attached, so they are really able to use their agency, and if they want to abuse it, they can and spend it all on drugs, or whether you have strings attached, it can only be used for college education or down paying a mortgage. I don't know, because in my realm, there wouldn't be no fees for college education. Canada would do the same as Germany and Sweden and Switzerland, and the state would pay for the college education as an investment collectively in our future. But we need to somehow start leveling out the gross inequality between the billionaires and those who have nothing but debts. It's totally got to be resolved. And it's got to come through taxation, both taxation on inheritances, taxation on wealth, and taxation on the higher income people. So Jeremy Singh is right on that score of it, but he doesn't go nearly far enough in spelling out how we do that wealth transfer.
So this next question is from the chat again, from Ted Sheldon.
Oh,
Thanks,
hi,
Guy.
Ted.
Authors and advocates such as Jeremy Rifkin and Naomi Klein have written on the Green New Deal, and there's a limited number of countries today committing to such an approach, including the EU. To what extent might you see the Green New Deal helping to provide an international solution to addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, equity, in the kind of international cooperative that you've been articulating?
So holy moly, that's the means of implementing a Green New Deal inside a country require the ability to give guaranteed jobs to people who are transitioning out of fossil fuels and stuff like that. You cannot do that internationally. So Canada can't guarantee America jobs because the jobs are in America. So the global equivalent of the Green New Deal has to come through financial transfers from the wealthy nations to the global south with strings attached of what those transfers can be used for, and setting up alliances of nations which are fossil fuel people, the Indias and the Indonesias, sharing skills with them about community-based job creation, about enterprise startup, about transitioning to solar and wind energy and all the jobs involved in that, and helping them apply that funding to the job guarantees for people who are working on the coal mines of India or Indonesia or China, to sort of speed their process of job security as they transition off those jobs, so that we can close all those jobs down ideally within 10 years, 10, 15 years. So the goal needs to be 100% reduction in emissions by 2040, 60% by 2030, which is a 7% every year. And so, you know, we need to move rapidly on that. And the curious thing is, when I heard Jagmeet Singh and other people asked about tar sands workers, he was asked, what will you do with the pipeline if you're a prime minister tomorrow morning? He should have said, it's really easy. We will shut the pipeline down and we will guarantee a transition support for every worker on the pipeline and all affected workers in Saskatchewan and Alberta and Newfoundland who depend on fossil fuel infrastructure for their incomes. And then they will be, okay, this man's got our back. I can go along with this. He didn't say that. I don't know why he didn't go there.
I also felt the debate had very little teeth. So
You're quite right. You're
yeah.
quite right.
Yes, I'm glad that many of these questions have come up, because they've been rattling around, you know, just the unsatisfaction of how they answered it. So it's fun to talk about. This next question comes from the WFMC, their new executive director, Alex McIsaac. Do you foresee any sort of global democratic institution to defend community democracies? If so, what kind of institution or program characteristics would it have in your view to prevent those dominating and promote those cooperative tendencies?
So there's two kinds of global institutions. There's nonprofits that work to do that. And there are lots of nonprofits of that kind that are working in this realm. And then there's nation-to-nation bodies. So we will need a global public assembly. Our United Nations is the equivalent of the Senate or the House of Lords, with a few appointed people. We need my thinking is a global United Nations assembly. And if you've got 10 billion people, you have one vote for every 10 million, which gives you 1,000 seats in that assembly, because beyond that, it really gets crazy. So all the Caribbean nations might unite together. So Canada would have 3 seats, for instance. America would have 33 seats. And you wouldn't allow delegates to be appointed by the government. So you wouldn't allow the Chinese Communist Party to appoint all 230 delegates. You'd have to have proportionally voting rules to participate in that assembly, and countries that couldn't meet those rules would not participate in that assembly. and they'd be shut out of those processes, which is obviously a weakness. But we need to begin bringing democracy, proper democracy, to the global stage. The weakness of the United Nations inherently is the nature of nuclear weapons, which led to the Security Council, because you can't tell a nuclear power what to do because they just wave a nuclear weapon at you, which is why those have the 5 seats on the Security Council. But we have to evolve beyond that. So having a group of nations committed to global democracy and disarmament and peace that would work together as a coalition similar to the G20 is an inherently valuable path forward. And Canada could take the leadership on that, along with a few other nations, Finland, Costa Rica, Denmark, Germany. There's a bunch of nations that would say, yeah, we're in with, we're part of this. We'll make this happen. Yeah.
I think this is the perfect time to transition to the next sort of question answer segment, and that is discussing world federalism in today. Keith McNeil talked about he said, global public assembly sounds a lot like UN parliamentary assembly. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Same thing. He's quite right. Yeah, same thing. I just haven't remembered the right phrase, but that is what I'm talking about, the global parliamentary assembly, yes. Yeah.
How do you foresee obtaining political will for something like this?
I believe that the political will is there at the popular level, that people instinctively know of. How can you have a mature planet that doesn't think together and act together collectively? We look at the pollution of the oceans, or that we know that we have to do this, but that the willingness to do that doesn't express itself until there's a leader who says, "Get behind me, let's make this happen," or a leadership group. And it's much more striking if there's an individual leader, who'll come up and say, like, India needed Mahatma Gandhi to lead the whole process of civil disobedience, and Satyagraha to sort of lead India to independence. And somewhere, the national leaders have got so sucked into national thinking, like they need to have the courage to articulate the global vision, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Jagmeet Singh or whoever else is, there's going to be new young people in their 20s and 30s who need to step forward and have the courage that they can take global leadership without necessarily assuming they're their prime minister or anything like that. The Green Party is not stepping up to the plate on this. It should be, because they all think that way, but they're not using their time to articulate this kind of way of thinking. But I know it's simmering there, it's just waiting there. As soon as a leader comes forward and says, this is a no-brainer, we need to cooperate globally, and our nation can take the lead in doing this. Canada took the lead on the Montreal Treaty to eliminate the ozone-depleting chemicals in 1988. And we got that treaty. Canada can step forward and do this kind of thing. They can invite countries to come to Quebec or Montreal and make it happen, or Vancouver. But we need that articulated by one of our leaders. It's not coming out of, Justin Trudeau's had 5 years and he hasn't articulated it. So I don't know where it's going to come from. The Green Party's in a bit of a internal mess at the moment. So, but there's, to the young people out there, one of you is going to be this person.
Very good.
I think Peter has a few words. He wants to thank you for everything you've said today. I want to say thank you. This has been a fantastic Q&A session, very engaging.
Okay. Well, Guy, thank you for a stimulating presentation on all kinds of policies for a new economy.
A new ecological civilization. That's what we need, Peter.
Yes, yes. I would agree with virtually all of the policies you recommended. The big issue, and it's been discussed in some of the questions and answers, is how do we build the political will? The problem is leadership. I think the problem is perhaps lack of participation among a large percentage of the population, and I think that's a tack that we need to follow. But thank you. This is an incredible list of policies and orientation for us, our World Federalist Group, and indeed the country to consider and work on.
I'd also like to add my thanks, Guy. This was a very informative and fascinating discussion. Thank you again. At this point in time, I think I would like to talk a little bit about world federalism and the world federalist movement. Perhaps either Erica or Walter, would you like to talk about world federalism? Let me ask you this, Erica. Tell me how did you come to the world federalist movement?
My first event was actually the collaboration with the Green Party of Canada earlier this summer that featured Elizabeth May. And ever since I started volunteering, this is how I came to the communications role. And soon I will be beginning at the Canada branch to help with our larger communications. We're looking to get several projects off the ground. So for anyone here today, or if you know someone, especially a young person, someone in school looking for experience, anything along those lines, we are looking for volunteers to run such projects as a model UN that will have a conference in the spring. We're also looking for people who are looking to make some content for our social medias. So for anyone interested, I'll put the WFMC info email in the chat now.
Thanks, Erica. Walter, can you speak to the World Federalist Movement itself, World Federalist Movement Canada?
I don't believe he's on. Maybe Alex?
Yes. Alex, could you? Is Alex on?
Yes.
Hey, I'm here. Yep. Thanks. So yeah, as Erica mentioned, we are planning some exciting projects for the future of the WFMC. We're establishing a sort of model UN type conference where we're going to be discussing, instead of, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with model UN conferences, you can definitely look it up, but basically it's a bunch of delegates from different schools that are sent to a conference to play the role as delegates, as countries. And we're planning on taking that and putting it towards, special conferences, as we call them, or special committees, where they'll be planning on reforming or, proposing reforms to the UN Security Council, etc. So they'll be presented with background guides on literature, on, the different effects of these types of policies, and they'll be making those decisions. So this is supposed to kind of attract a youth side to the World Federalist Movement. And we will be also establishing World Federalist clubs on the side, which will be established in different universities and colleges and, operate regionally and interact a lot with the WFMC Toronto, WFMC Victoria, Montreal, and other branches as well. So those are the exciting projects coming up. Definitely register as a World Federalist Movement member, and we will keep you updated through the newsletters. You can also take action and participate in the questionnaire for the federal elections in 2021. Thanks.
Thanks. Anybody who's got any questions before we wrap up on world federalism or the World Federalist Movement? You can put them in the chat, perhaps. I have a few announcements. Sorry, go ahead.
You're going to proceed with the announcements? I was just about to say there's the announcement section.
Okay, I'll proceed with the announcements. I've got a few announcements. First, upcoming events. Our next event is the first of our bi-monthly members discussion on topics of interest. On Sunday, September 26th, between 1 and 3 p.m., we will. Sorry, Erica, can you explain that a little bit? I don't have it.
We're going to have a members meeting discussing peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping, headed by the president of the WFMC, Walter Dorn. I encourage everyone to come. I am also a research assistant for Walter, and his work is truly fascinating, and he's in regular communication with lots of UN figures, and there's some interesting things on the horizon. I'm very excited for that event. Otherwise, on the agenda, we have in October, another event we have, October 13th at 7 p.m. Christine Perringer will be talking about better climate governance. She is a facilitator and expert on international negotiations. So please tune in then. Yes, that's everything.
Okay.
That's all of our
Thanks,
updates.
Erica. Thanks, Erica. The World Paris Movement, the Toronto branch is seeking volunteers. If you have a skill you would like to contribute to the branch, please email info@wfmctoronto.org. For anyone who is, the cost of membership in our organization is $60 per individual, and it's reduced to $15 for students and others with limited income. On behalf of myself and the Toronto Board of Directors, I thank everyone for having joined and participating in today's event. Guy Dauncey for the presentation, Peter Venton for the introductions, Erica for moderating the event, John Cohen and Rose Tyson for their behind-the-scenes work leading up to and during this presentation. The Toronto branch is here to serve our members. Currently, we do this by arranging talks such as this and also our bi-monthly members meetings, where members get together to work on furthering World Federalist cause. At our last members meeting, we discussed going beyond just being a think tank. If you are a member, please join us on September 26th. If you are not a member and believe in the only solution to global problems such as climate and war, being through a federated world government, the same system of government we have in Canada today, comprising of a municipal layer, a provincial layer, and a national layer, with the addition of a missing global layer, please consider joining our movement. You can register to become a member at www.wfmccanada.org/donate. I look forward to seeing you all on September 26th. And I wish you all a very good night. Bye, everybody.
Good evening, all.